Let's paint a picture in our minds that will erase the familiar images that have been imposed on us for decades. Imagine not just a smithy, but an entire artisan quarter of a medieval town at dawn. The air here is thick and heavy, saturated with the acrid smell of charcoal, damp earth, and red-hot metal. The rhythmic, deafening blow of the hammer is not just the sound of work, it is the very heartbeat of this place, its pulse, which echoes through the narrow streets. In this fiery crucible, amid the hissing steam, when red-hot steel is plunged into water, and in dazzling showers of sparks, something greater than mere protective clothing was born. Here, generation after generation, man challenged the very idea of his own vulnerability. Here, in pain and labor, a steel phoenix was born, full-plate armor. But was it the cumbersome, unwieldy cage we imagine it to be today? Was its wearer a slow and clumsy statue that had to be hoisted onto a horse with a winch? Historical chronicles paint a completely different, almost fantastical picture. They describe, for example, one of the marshals of France in the 15th century, a man who, being clad from head to toe in shining steel, performed miracles of athleticism. He could, without using stirrups, merely resting his hand on the saddle, leap onto the back of his mighty warhorse with one springy movement. He could perform acrobatic somersaults on the ground to evade an attack, or, approaching a siege ladder, climb up its steep, reverse side using only the incredible strength of his arms. This is not a legend, but a fact documented by contemporaries, which completely shatters our preconceptions. How was this possible? The answer lies in a genius technology that we are only now beginning to truly appreciate. Get ready, we're going back in time to take this steel mechanism apart and show why it wasn't a cage, but the first high-tech exoskeleton in human history. Imagine yourself at a medieval tournament. This is not just a competition, it is a showcase of military prowess. The air trembles with the roar of thousands of voices, the neighing of horses, and the sounds of trumpets and horns. Your opponent is charging at you, and here it is, the moment of impact. You deliver a precise, powerful blow, putting all your strength and skill into it. But instead of the piercing screech of steel being pierced, instead of the expected effect, you hear only a dull, sliding sound, and your blade, as if hitting an invisible force field, helplessly slips away. Why? The answer lies in pure physics and geometry. The armor was not just a thick layer of metal, it was a masterpiece of kinetic architecture. The greatest masters intuitively understood the fundamental law that modern engineers use when designing the hulls of armored vehicles and spacecraft: deflecting impact energy is much more effective than trying to absorb it. The surface of armor has never been perfectly flat. It consisted of many sloping edges, smooth curves, and bulges. The breastplate was rounded, the shoulder pads resembled smooth shells, and the helmet looked like a steel egg. All this was done for one purpose: to prevent the enemy's weapons from finding a point of support. Instead of concentrating all its energy in one point, the blow of a sword or axe was distributed across the entire surface and slid off without causing any harm. Moreover, the finest examples of the so-called Gothic style, developed in the German lands, were covered with a network of delicate grooves, or corrugations. These grooves were not merely decorative. Similar to corrugated cardboard or modern stiffening ribs in structures, they greatly increased the strength of thin metal sheets without adding weight. At the same time, they served as traps for sliding blades, causing them to slide across the surface and ultimately lose their destructive force. It was a passive defense system of incredible elegance and effectiveness. Who were these geniuses who created these technological marvels? They cannot be called simple blacksmiths or craftsmen. They were true alchemists of steel, transforming rough, unattractive metal into marvels of engineering. In some cities in southern Germany and northern Italy, entire dynasties of weaponsmiths flourished, passing their secrets down from father to son for centuries. Their workshops were not just smithies, but veritable scientific laboratories. They had a thorough knowledge of the properties of different types of steel and knew how to combine them. The process began with the selection of metal. This was not ordinary iron. The craftsmen sought a special type of steel with a precise carbon content that, when properly processed, would acquire the necessary properties. They knew that different parts of the armor required different treatments. The breastplate and helmet had to be as hard as diamond to withstand a direct blow. Therefore, they were subjected to a complex hardening process, heated to a precise temperature determined by the color of the annealing, and then rapidly cooled in water or oil. However, steel that was too hard became brittle. Therefore, after hardening, a tempering process followed, which involved reheating to a lower temperature to remove internal stresses and give the metal the necessary ductility. Plates for joints, elbow pads, and knee pads required greater flexibility and plasticity. They were processed differently to make them less hard but more resistant to repeated bending. The fame of these dynasties was so great that powerful emperors and kings granted these master craftsmen noble titles and personal coats of arms, recognizing their genius on a par with aristocratic lineage. To obtain armor bearing the personal mark of such a master, a small sign stamped on the metal, was a symbol of the highest status and a guarantee of the highest quality. It meant that you were wearing not just steel, but a work of art created by the best minds and hands of their era. Such technological perfection in defense inevitably gave rise to a silent but incredibly intense dialogue between the hammer and the anvil, between armor and weapons. It was the great arms race of the Middle Ages. When it became clear that cutting or piercing armor was an almost impossible task for an ordinary sword, military thinking took a completely different path. Instead of trying to break down the wall, they began to look for a door in it. Highly specialized weapons appeared. For example, the estoc was a long, rigid, faceted sword without a cutting edge, essentially a steel awl designed not for cutting but for precise thrusts into vulnerable joints of armor, the armpits, the crook of the elbow, and the gaps in the visor. Complex combination weapons also appeared, such as the poleaxe, a true marvel of engineering, the Swiss Army knife of medieval warriors. On a single long shaft, it combined a sharp spike for stabbing, a heavy hammer for stunning blows, and an axe blade for attacking less protected areas. In response, armorers began to close these vulnerabilities. Additional round, bisagu, shields appeared to protect the armpits, complex multi-layered plates on the joints, and even special steel skirts, tassets. Combat turned from a simple exchange of blows into complex, almost surgical work. Warriors began using special techniques such as the half-sword, where a fighter would grasp his own blade with one hand by the hilt and the other by the middle of the blade, turning the sword into a short spear for more precise control and thrusting. It was an intellectual duel where the winner was not the strongest, but the one who knew the anatomy of the enemy's armor better and had greater composure. How, being encased in this multi-layered steel cocoon, could one maintain the mobility described in the chronicles? The myth of a weight of 50 to 60 kilograms and sluggishness comes from later, purely tournament armor. They were indeed heavier, but their purpose was different, to withstand a direct spear thrust at high speed, where mobility was secondary. Real 15th century combat armor weighed an average of 20 to 25 kilograms. That's a lot, but not excessive. The weight of a modern firefighter's or special forces soldier's equipment is comparable, and sometimes even greater. The secret lay not in the weight, but in its ingenious distribution. Under the armor, he wore not just a doublet, but a complex system known as an arming doublet. It was a thick quilted jacket, often reinforced with pieces of chain mail, and covered with dozens of attachment points, strong leather laces. Each of the more than 200 pieces of armor was not simply worn on top, but meticulously tied to these points. The leggings were attached to the camisole belt, the shoulder pads to the shoulders, and the elbow pads to the sleeves. This system, like tendons in the body, connected the metal to the person, allowing the armor to move as one with its wearer. The load was distributed not only to the shoulders, but also to the waist, hips, and across the entire torso. As a result, the knight did not wear the armor, he became it. He did not feel it as a dead weight, but as his own suddenly strengthened and invulnerable musculature. This gave them freedom of movement that was absolutely unthinkable for such a level of protection and allowed them to perform the acrobatic feats that so amazed their contemporaries. Now let's go beyond pure mechanics and talk about psychology. A knight's attack was not just a tactical maneuver. It was a grand, carefully choreographed psychological spectacle. Try closing your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in the ranks of the infantry, perhaps a peasant militia. You are standing in a field, armed with a spear and a simple helmet at best. And looming out of the morning mist is not just a squadron of horsemen. A living earthquake is moving toward you. The ground shakes from the pounding of hundreds of hooves. The air is filled with a deafening symphony of steel. It's not just a clang, it's a complex, multi-voiced roar consisting of the squeaking of thousands of leather straps, the dull clanging of steel plates, and the neighing of battle horses encased in armor. And most importantly, the visual effect. You don't see people. You see a wall of mirror-polished steel that catches and reflects the sun's rays, turning each rider into a dazzling, inhuman figure, almost like an avenging angel. Their faces are hidden behind soulless visors, often designed as grotesque, predatory masks, which completely dehumanize them, turning them into ruthless machines. It was a theater of power and fear, designed to break your spirit, to make you believe that you were facing a higher, insurmountable force, and to defeat you before the battle even began. The cost of this technological marvel was truly astronomical, and it is difficult for modern people to comprehend. A full suit of armor from a renowned master did not cost as much as a modern car. It cost as much as a fleet of luxury cars. Its price could equal the annual income of an entire city or the cost of building a large stone bridge. For the price of one suit of armor, you could buy a herd of 50 to 60 select war horses or hire an entire squad of several hundred mercenaries for the entire military season. Therefore, armor was not just equipment. It was a strategic asset, a treasure that was carefully guarded. It was not simply cleaned and lubricated, it was cherished and nurtured. Armor was included in royal treasuries alongside crowns and scepters. It was used as collateral in major financial transactions between states. It was given as a valuable diplomatic gift to strengthen alliances. And on the battlefield, capturing enemy armor was not just a trophy, but a way to instantly enrich oneself. There was a concept of armor set. It was not just a single piece of armor, but a whole set of hundreds of interchangeable parts stored in huge chests. From these, construction set parts, armor could be assembled for any task, lighter for foot combat, reinforced for jousting in tournaments, or incredibly ornate, with gilding and engraving, for ceremonial occasions. This enormous price was the visible embodiment and foundation of the entire feudal system. The world was clearly divided between those who could afford their own personal mountain of steel and everyone else. Contrary to popular belief, the advent of gunpowder did not cause the immediate decline of armor. It was a long and complex process that spanned several centuries. The first guns, the arquebus of the 15th century, were extremely unreliable and inaccurate, took several minutes to reload, and often lacked the power to penetrate high-quality armor at the necessary range. Throughout the 16th century, the golden age of armor, armorers successfully adapted to the new threat. They created thickened, so-called bulletproof breastplates. Sometimes you can even see a special dent on them. This is a proof mark. The master craftsman would fire a pistol at the finished product in front of the customer to prove its reliability. The decline began not when armor became possible to pierce, but when the very philosophy and economics of warfare changed radically. It became cheaper and more effective to maintain and train large armies armed with muskets than to field a small number of elite but incredibly expensive armored warriors. Success on the battlefield was now determined not by individual valor and defense, but by discipline, formation density, and the power of coordinated fire. Armor did not disappear overnight. It began to undress. First, leg protection was abandoned, then arm protection. The cuirass, which protected the torso, and the helmet lasted the longest. In this form, as worn by cuirassiers, for example, armor remained in use in the cavalry of the Napoleonic Wars and even until the beginning of the 20th century. The era of knights faded slowly and majestically, like a tired sun setting over the horizon, leaving behind a world that would never be the same again, but would forever preserve the memory of this shining steel age. The next time you find yourself in a museum hall and approach a display case containing medieval armor, don't just walk by. Stop for a moment. Don't look at it as a cold, lifeless artifact. Look closely at the delicate engraving, the smooth, almost organic lines, the deep, matte sheen of metal that has survived centuries. Try to imagine not just a warrior, but the person inside. Feel the warmth of his body, hear the sound of his muffled breathing behind the visor, feel the tremendous discipline and strength of spirit necessary not just to fight, but to live in this second skin of steel. What you see before you is not just a historical exhibit. What you see before you is a time capsule. It contains the ambitions of kings, the genius of engineers, the artistry of artists, and the very essence of an entire civilization built on power and status. It is the materialized dream of man's invulnerability, of overcoming his own fragility. It is a poem frozen in metal about genius, power, beauty, and downfall, whose echoes we still hear in every story about knights and dragons, in every film about honor and valor. And now you know that the truth was much more complicated and interesting than any legend.